The house was too big for one person, but Garrett Moss had never been good at choosing practical things. He'd picked it because it had a study with windows facing east, which meant morning light for his coffee and spreadsheets, and because the rent was cheap enough that he didn't have to think about money while he figured out what to do with the rest of his life. Saving a planet apparently didn't come with a pension plan. 3 years ago, he'd been part of the human delegation to Valith Prime during what the media called the crisis. In reality, it had been a bureaucratic nightmare involving water rights, mining contracts, and several factions who all believed they had the moral high ground. Garrett's job had been translating legal frameworks and finding compromise in the spaces between languages. Not heroic, not exciting, just exhausting meetings and too much bad coffee. But it had worked. The fighting stopped. Reconstruction began. And Garrett, who'd never wanted recognition, found himself on a list of honored friends of Valith that came with perks he hadn't asked for. Like Solara. She'd arrived 6 months ago with a formal letter from the Valith Council, explaining that as part of their cultural exchange and gratitude program, they were offering skilled individuals to assist honored humans with daily needs. Garrett had tried to refuse. The whole concept made him uncomfortable. The power dynamic, the implication that he needed servants, the reminder that he'd done something noteworthy when he'd mostly just survived meetings. But the council had been insistent, and Solara had been standing in his doorway with a small bag and an expression of polite determination that suggested refusing would cause more problems than accepting. So now he had a maid, or a housekeeper, or a companion. He still wasn't sure what to call her. She was Valith, tall and graceful with silver-toned skin that shifted through subtle hues depending on her mood, though Garrett had never quite figured out the color meanings. Her ears were the most striking feature, elegantly pointed and rising several inches above her head, expressive in ways that human ears simply weren't. She wore simple clothes in muted colors and moved through his home like water, present but somehow never intrusive. She cooked meals he didn't request, cleaned spaces he hadn't realized were dirty, and maintained a garden in his backyard that now bloomed with plants from both their worlds in combinations that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. And she barely spoke. Garrett had tried. He'd insisted she call him by his name instead of honored one or sir. He'd set a place for her at the table for every meal, though she usually ate in the kitchen after he'd finished. He'd given her full access to his entertainment systems, encouraged her to take days off, asked about her family and her life before coming here. She answered in polite monosyllables and returned to her work. After a while, he'd stopped trying, settling into an awkward routine where they orbited each other like planets that shared space but never touched. Tonight had been long. A consulting project had hit complications, requiring Garrett to spend 14 hours in virtual meetings with engineers who all had opinions about structural integrity but no interest in compromise. He'd worked through lunch and dinner, sustained by whatever Solara had left on the desk beside him, sandwiches that appeared at regular intervals, tea that stayed somehow warm for hours, small pastries that tasted like nostalgia for a childhood he'd never had. When he finally logged off, his neck ached and his eyes felt full of sand. The house was dark except for the hallway lights Solara always left on. She knew he didn't like navigating in complete darkness, though he'd never told her that directly. He stumbled toward his bedroom, planning to collapse into unconsciousness for at least 10 hours. Honored Moss. He turned. Solara stood in the doorway to the kitchen, backlit by soft light that made her silhouette shimmer. She wore a sleeping robe, something flowing and pale that suggested he'd caught her before she'd retired to her quarters. "Garrett," he corrected automatically. "Just Garrett, please." She ducked her head in acknowledgement but didn't use his name. "I apologize for disturbing your rest." "You're not, I wasn't asleep yet. What's wrong? Do you need something?" Her ears tilted back slightly, an expression he couldn't read. She stepped forward and he noticed her skin had shifted to a deeper silver with hints of violet at her throat and cheeks. "I wanted to ask." She paused, her hands clasping together in front of her. Can we do it again tonight? Garrett's exhausted brain stuttered to a halt. I'm sorry, what? Again tonight, she repeated, her voice barely audible. If it's not too much trouble, I understand you're tired, but I thought perhaps. He stared at her. She stared back, her large eyes luminous in the dim light, her ears now pressed flat against her head in what he was fairly certain was distress. Solara, I have no idea what you're talking about. The violet in her skin deepened to something close to purple, flooding up from her throat to her ears. Oh no, I thought, but perhaps I misunderstood. She took a step back. Please forgive me, I shouldn't have presumed. Presumed what? Garrett moved closer, concern overriding his confusion. Solara, I'm not upset. I genuinely don't know what you're asking about. She looked down at her hands. The dinner, 2 weeks ago when the power failed. We ate together by candlelight. You told me about your sister and her children. I told you about my grandmother's garden. She glanced up, her eyes shining with something that might have been tears. I thought perhaps we could do that again. Share a meal, talk, but I see now that it was simply necessity for you, not. She trailed off, turned away. Not what? Garrett asked, but she was already walking back toward the kitchen, her shoulders rigid with what he recognized, finally, as embarrassment. Good night, honored Moss. I apologize for the intrusion. She disappeared into the kitchen before he could respond, leaving him standing in the hallway with his tea growing cold in his hands, and the sudden, uncomfortable realization that he'd been blind to something important. He looked down at the cup. It was his favorite blend, prepared exactly how he liked it, delivered at precisely the moment he needed it. Just like everything else Solara did. Not because it was her job, but because she'd been paying attention. Because she cared. The hallway light flickered slightly, and Garrett wondered how many other things he'd missed while assuming she was just efficiently performing duties. How many small gestures had been offers of connection that he'd accepted as service. He set the tea down on a side table and walked toward the kitchen, where he could see Solara's silhouette moving behind the translucent door. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he'd figure out what that dinner had meant to her. Tomorrow he'd pay attention. Tonight, standing in his too-big house with its lights he hadn't asked for, and its garden that bloomed with impossible flowers, Garrett Moss finally understood that he'd been living with someone who saw him, and he'd never thought to look back. Her ears, he remembered, had been flushed violet. He pulled out his tablet and searched for Valith color meanings. Violet, he learned, meant hope. Garrett woke up at dawn, which was unusual for someone who generally believed morning was a theoretical concept rather than a necessary reality. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching the light change through his east-facing window, and tried to figure out how to apologize for something he hadn't realized he'd done. Or hadn't done. The specifics were still unclear. He found Solara in the kitchen, already preparing breakfast with the kind of fluid efficiency that made cooking look like choreography. She glanced up when he entered, her ears doing a small twitch of surprise before resuming their neutral position. Good morning, honored Moss. Breakfast will be ready in approximately 15 minutes. Garrett, he said, and I was actually hoping we could talk first. Her hands stilled over the vegetables she'd been chopping. Of course. Have I done something incorrect? No, God, no, the opposite actually. He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, then gestured to the one across from him. Would you sit with me, please? She hesitated, her skin shifting through shades of silver that he was starting to recognize as uncertainty. Finally, she set down her knife, wiped her hands on a towel, and sat with the posture of someone preparing for formal judgment. Last night, Garrett began, you asked me something and I was too tired and stupid to understand what you were really asking. I'm sorry about that. Can we start over? Her ears tilted forward slightly. Start over. You asked if we could do it again. The dinner, the conversation, and I'm here to say yes, absolutely yes, but I also want to understand why you thought you had to ask permission for that. The colors in her skin shifted again, warming slightly. Among my people, sharing a meal outside of formal necessity is significant. It indicates willingness to engage in social bonding. When we had dinner during the power failure, I thought perhaps you were extending an offer of companionship. But when you didn't repeat the invitation, I assumed I'd misread the situation. You didn't misread anything. I'm just an idiot who didn't realize that dinner was different from all the other dinners, where you very kindly leave food for me while I work like an antisocial hermit. A small sound escaped her, almost like a laugh. You're not antisocial, you're focused. I admire that about you. You admire my ability to ignore another person living in my house. I admire your dedication to your work, your desire to help others even when they're on different planets, the way you think through problems methodically. Her ears rose higher, becoming more animated. During the dinner, you told me about the negotiation sessions during the crisis, how you'd stay up all night finding legal precedents that might satisfy all parties, how you learned basic Valith in 3 weeks because you thought understanding the language would help you understand the concerns. That's not hermit behavior. That's someone who cares deeply but perhaps shows it through action rather than words. Garrett sat back surprised. You remember all that? I remember everything you've told me. She looked down at her hands, which were folded carefully on the table. I remember that you hum when you're solving a difficult problem. Always the same 3 notes. I remember that you leave the hallway light on because you mentioned once, during a call with your sister, that you've never liked complete darkness since you were a child. I remember that you make terrible jokes to yourself when you think no one's listening, and that you always say thank you when I bring you tea, even though you don't have to. He stared at her. Why? Why do I remember? Why do you pay attention to all of that? Her skin flushed with color, violet again, deeper than before. Because I wanted to know you. Because when the council offered me this position, I volunteered immediately. I didn't draw the short straw, as you once mentioned thinking. I requested you specifically. Why would you do that? She stood abruptly, her ears flattening with what he was learning to recognize as nervousness. May I show you something? In my quarters. Of course. He followed her through the house to the small wing he'd always thought of as her private space. He'd never entered it, respecting her right to boundaries in a living situation that already blurred professional lines. When she opened the door, he understood why she'd kept it private. The walls were covered with pieces of her life, pressed flowers arranged in patterns that suggested constellations, sketches of gardens with plants he didn't recognize, drawn with delicate precision, small notes in Valith script that he couldn't read but recognized as poetry from the way the words curved, and photographs, dozens of them, showing a world before the crisis, when Valith Prime had been whole. In the center of the room on an easel stood a painting in progress. It showed him, sitting at his desk, surrounded by the morning light he loved, his face focused but peaceful. The detail was extraordinary. She'd captured the exact way he tilted his head when reading, the specific mess of his hair, the small scar on his left hand from an accident with a soldering iron years ago. I've been working on it since I arrived, Solara said quietly, trying to capture the moment I first saw you, not during the crisis, after when you came for the reconstruction talks. Garrett couldn't speak. The painting wasn't just technically skilled, it was intimate. It showed him the way someone who cared would see him. There was a session on agricultural restoration, she continued. You were supposed to meet with regional leaders, but you arrived early and saw my grandmother struggling with a broken irrigation panel in the courtyard. You stopped and helped her fix it. Spent an hour on your hands and knees in the mud, troubleshooting the electrical system. She didn't know who you were, just another human in work clothes, but you were kind to her, patient. You made her laugh. I remember that, Garrett said. She told me about her granddaughter who studied environmental restoration, who wanted to bring back the singing gardens. That was me. Solara turned to face him fully. I was watching from the building. I saw you help her. Saw you treat her like she mattered, even though she was no one important. even though you had important meetings. After you left, she told me she'd met a good man, that if all humans were like you, maybe the peace would last. Her ears trembled slightly. I never forgot that. When the council started the gratitude program, I applied immediately. I told them I wanted to serve someone who'd helped our world, but truly. I wanted to meet the man who'd been kind to an invisible old woman because kindness was simply who he was. Garrett looked at the painting, then at her, then at the walls covered with pieces of a life he'd never bothered to ask about. I had no idea. I know you never asked, but I didn't mind. I preferred to learn about you through observation, through the small things that reveal who people really are. She smiled and it transformed her face. Like the way you always leave an extra cup of tea for me, even though you think I don't notice. Or how you've never asked me to work on rest days, even though the contract says you could. Or how you mute your calls when you think I might be resting, so you don't disturb me. You noticed all that. I notice everything about you. The violet in her skin deepened. Which is why I hoped the dinner meant what I thought it meant, and why I was brave enough to ask for another one. Garrett stepped closer to the painting, seeing himself through her eyes, not as he saw himself, flawed and uncertain, but as someone worth knowing, worth painting, worth crossing the galaxy to serve. Have dinner with me, he said, tonight, and tomorrow, and whenever you want, not because I'm honored or because you work here, but because I want to know you the way you know me. I want to hear about the singing gardens and your grandmother, and everything else I've been too blind to ask about. Her ears rose, trembling with emotion. You don't have to. I want to, he interrupted. I should have wanted to 6 months ago, but I was so worried about doing the right thing, about not abusing the power dynamic, that I never considered you might actually want to be here, that we might want to know each other. I very much want that, she whispered. Then let's start over. Hi, I'm Garrett Moss. I'm a consulting engineer who talks to himself and has strong opinions about proper tea preparation. I'm told I hum when I work, though I've never noticed. I'm not good at reading social cues, but I'm trying to get better. She laughed, the sound like bells. Hello, Garrett Moss. I'm Solara of the Western Gardens. I paint and remember everything and volunteered to travel across the galaxy because a man was kind to my grandmother. I'm very patient, but I'm tired of pretending I'm only here to clean your house. He held out his hand. She looked at it, then took it, her skin warm against his. Nice to finally meet you, he said. Nice to finally be seen, she replied. And for the first time in 6 months, they sat down to breakfast together, not as employer and servant, but as two people choosing to know each other. The food burned slightly while they talked, but neither of them minded. The next 3 weeks rewrote everything Garrett thought he knew about his own life. Dinner became a ritual they both protected fiercely. Garrett started leaving his office by 7 every evening, no matter what project was demanding attention. Solara began experimenting with dishes that combined human and Valith ingredients in ways that sometimes worked brilliantly, and sometimes resulted in meals they laughingly fed to the garden's composting system. They talked through everything. She told him about growing up in the Western Gardens, where her family had cultivated plants that produced harmonic frequencies, natural music that changed with the seasons and the time of day. She described the war in personal terms, not as history but as the day her mother's favorite singing willow stopped making sound, the morning they realized the water was too contaminated for the garden to survive, the moment she decided to study restoration, because destroying was easy but rebuilding was defiant. He told her about Earth, about growing up with a sister who was braver than he'd ever be, about choosing engineering because he liked problems with clear solutions, and then discovering that the most important problems rarely had clear solutions at all. He explained why he'd come to Valith, not heroism, just a job offer, and why he'd stayed involved with reconstruction even after the crisis ended. I kept thinking about your grandmother, he admitted one evening, about all the grandmothers and gardens and normal lives that got caught in the middle of something they didn't start. I wanted to help fix that, even in small ways. You fixed it in large ways, Solara said. But I think I understand now why you don't see yourself as heroic. You see yourself as someone who did their job. Because that's what it was. To you, perhaps. To the people who can now drink clean water and return to their homes, you're the person who made that possible. She reached across the table and took his hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. You don't have to be comfortable with recognition for it to be true. They developed other rituals too. Morning tea together before Garrett started work, with Solara teaching him the Valeth ceremony that involved specific temperatures and steeping times and small prayers of gratitude. Evening walks through the forest where she'd point out hybrid plants that were adapting to the mixed environment, creating new species that belonged to both worlds and neither. She showed him how to read the color changes in her skin, a lesson that involved patience and attention, and made him realize how much information he'd been missing. Silver meant contentment. Violet was hope and affection. Deep blue suggested focus or contemplation. Golden tones indicated joy. Pale gray was worry. What about now? He asked one evening as they walked. Her skin had shifted to a warm amber color he hadn't seen before. She glanced at him, her ears doing a small flutter. That's complicated. Try me. It means I'm happy and terrified in equal measure, which doesn't make sense as a combination, but feelings rarely do. Why terrified? She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Because this matters. Because I came here with hope but no expectations, and now I have both, and that makes everything feel fragile. Because among my people, what we're doing, these rituals, this attention, this care, it's the beginning of bonding. And bonding is forever. Garrett's heart did something complicated in his chest. Forever. Not in the human way of making promises you might break. In the Valeth way of intertwining lives so completely that separation becomes unthinkable. We don't have divorce. We have bonded pairs who become permanent parts of each other's families, lives, identities. Her skin paled slightly, shifting toward gray. I'm not trying to pressure you. I'm just trying to be honest about what this means to me, to my culture. So you can decide if that's something you want or if we should stop before. He kissed her. It wasn't planned or eloquent, just an impulse that bypassed every logical thought in his brain and went straight to the certainty that he didn't want her to finish that sentence. Didn't want to hear her suggest they stop when stopping was the last thing he wanted. She made a small sound of surprise, then melted into him, her hands coming up to frame his face. She tasted like the tea they'd had earlier, like earth and Valeth mixed together into something new. When they pulled apart, her skin had bloomed into brilliant gold. That's joy, right? He asked breathlessly. That's joy, she confirmed, laughing. And relief, and hope, and about 7 other emotions I don't have the English words for. Good, that's good, because I'm terrified too, but not of forever. I'm terrified of messing this up, of not understanding your culture well enough, of hurting you accidentally because I don't know what I'm doing. Then we'll learn together. She pressed her forehead against his, a gesture he'd learned was intimate among her people. I don't need you to be Valeth. I just need you to be willing. I'm willing. They walked home holding hands, and when they reached his house, their house, he was starting to think. Solara didn't return to her separate quarters. She stayed with him, and they talked through the night about what bonding meant, what commitment looked like across species, what they both wanted from a future that suddenly felt vast with possibility. The community noticed. Garrett's neighbor, another human settler named Patricia, cornered him at the local market with a knowing smile. So you and the Valeth woman, she said. Solara, Garrett corrected. Right, Solara, you two are together now. We're figuring it out. Patricia's smile softened. Good for you. Ignore the gossips. Half of them are just jealous that you found someone who looks at you like you're the best thing in 2 galaxies. But not everyone was supportive. A former colleague contacted him, voice carefully neutral, suggesting that Garrett should be cautious about relationships with Valeth. particularly those who'd come through the gratitude program. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, Marcus hedged. Just that the power dynamic is complicated. She was assigned to you. There's inherent imbalance there. Garrett had wanted to argue, to defend what he and Solara had, but the words stuck because Marcus wasn't entirely wrong. He brought it up to Solara that evening, guilt making his voice rough. Did you feel like you had to respond to me, because of the program or gratitude or some sense of obligation? Her ears flattened and her skin went pale gray. Is that what you think, that I'm with you out of duty? No, maybe, I don't know, I just want to make sure you have real choice in this, that you're not. I volunteered to come here, she interrupted, her voice sharp in a way he'd never heard. I requested you specifically. I have a degree in environmental restoration and could have had positions anywhere on Valith Prime, but I chose to travel to another world because I wanted to meet you. None of that was obligation. It was choice, my choice. But the program itself. The program is gratitude, yes, but gratitude doesn't mean subservience. It means we recognize what was done for us and we offer our skills in return. I offered mine to you because I wanted to, not because I had to. And everything that's happened since, every dinner, every conversation, every moment of this, I've chosen all of it. She stepped closer, her eyes fierce. Don't diminish my agency because you're uncomfortable with the circumstances of how we met. I'm capable of making my own decisions, and I decided I wanted you. If you don't want me, say so. But don't hide behind concern for my autonomy when the real issue is your own fear. She was right. He'd been using concern as a shield against his own terror of wanting something this much. I want you, he said simply. I'm just scared of failing you. Her skin shifted back toward silver, her ears rising. Then don't fail me. Choose me the way I chose you. Keep choosing me. That's all bonding is, continuous choice, made every day until it becomes as natural as breathing. That night, they attended a bonding ceremony for a Valith couple in the settlement. Garrett watched as the two individuals stood before their community, hands joined, speaking vows in that flowing language he was slowly learning. Watched as their families came forward to acknowledge the bond, weaving colored threads around the couple's joined hands to symbolize the intertwining of their lives. It was beautiful and overwhelming, and made forever feel both impossible and inevitable. Do you want that? Solara whispered beside him. Someday. He looked at her, at the woman who'd crossed a galaxy to meet him, who'd been patient while he learned to see her, who'd chosen him with full knowledge and clear intention. He thought about morning tea ceremonies and evening walks and the way her ears expressed more than words ever could. Yes, he said, someday soon. Her skin bloomed gold, and she took his hand, weaving their fingers together in a pattern that looked suspiciously like the beginning of the ceremony they were watching. In the back of his mind, Garrett heard Marcus's warnings about power dynamics and cultural complications. But louder than that, he heard Solara's voice saying she'd chosen him, and his own heart saying he chose her back. Everything else was just details they'd figure out together. 3 months later, Garrett woke up to the sound of something crashing in the kitchen, followed by Solara's creative cursing in 2 languages. He smiled into his pillow, recognizing the particular tone that meant she was attempting human breakfast food again despite his repeated assurances that toast wasn't worth this much effort. Need help? He called out. I have it under control, she called back, just as something else clattered to the floor. He got up and found her surrounded by what appeared to be the casualties of a battle with a waffle iron. Her ears were flat with frustration, her skin shifting between silver and pale gray. It's conspiring against me, she said seriously. Human cooking technology is passive-aggressive. Or you could just have cereal. But cereal isn't a proper meal. You need protein and carbohydrates and, oh, it's smoking. Why is it smoking? Garrett disconnected the waffle iron before it could achieve sentience, and turned to find Solara glaring at it like it had personally insulted her ancestors. I wanted to make you breakfast, she said, sounding defeated. The traditional way, like you make me tea every morning. You do make me breakfast, most mornings, when you're not trying to wrestle advanced technology. That's different. That's Valeth breakfast, which is mostly fruit and some protein paste that you tolerate but don't love. I wanted to make you something from your home. He pulled her into a hug, feeling her gradually relax against him. You are something from my home. You're what makes this home. She made a sound that was half laugh, half exasperation. You're very sweet when I'm failing at basic tasks. You're not failing, you're learning. There's a difference. He kissed the top of her head, right between her ears. Also, I'm pretty sure that waffle iron was defective. Patricia said hers caught fire twice before she threw it away. They ended up eating cereal and fruit together, sitting at the table where they'd had that first awkward conversation about dinner. So much had changed since then, but also nothing had changed. They were still two people choosing to share space and time and life together. The previous weeks had been full of adjustments. Solara had officially moved from her quarters into their bedroom, a transition that involved rearranging furniture multiple times because they had very different ideas about optimal room organization. She insisted on flowers in every room, small vases of mixed earth and Valeth blooms that somehow never died despite Garrett's infamous inability to keep plants alive. He'd introduced her to the concept of lazy Sundays, where productivity was replaced by old movies and extended naps and absolutely no obligations. They'd learned each other's languages more deeply. He could now speak conversational Valeth, though his accent made her ears twitch with amusement. She'd mastered the nuances of English humor, though she still sometimes delivered punchlines with perfect deadpan that was either intentional or accidental genius. The community had gradually accepted them. Most of the neighbors treated them like any other couple, which Garrett found both relieving and profound, the ordinariness of being extraordinary. Patricia had taken to leaving baked goods on their doorstep with notes like, "For the lovebirds," and "Eat something that isn't cereal." But not everyone was comfortable. There were still whispers, still questions about whether their relationship was appropriate given how they'd met. Garrett had overheard a conversation at the market where two settlers debated whether Solara could really have chosen freely, or whether she was just fulfilling expectations. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. "You're thinking too loud," Solara said, pulling him out of his thoughts. "I can feel your worry from here. Just remembering some comments I heard about us." Her ears tilted forward, attentive. "What kind of comments?" "The kind that suggest you're here because you have to be, not because you want to be." She was quiet for a moment, then set down her spoon with careful precision. "Do you believe that?" "No, but I hate that other people do." "Then their opinion is their problem, not ours." She reached across the table to take his hand. "I could leave tomorrow if I wanted. The program has provisions for early termination if either party is unhappy. I could request a transfer to any restoration project on Valeth Prime. I could return to my family's gardens, which are being rebuilt and need skilled workers. I have choices, Garrett. I've always had choices, and I keep choosing you." "I know, I just wish everyone else knew it too." "They will, or they won't, and it won't matter because we'll be too busy being happy to care." A message came through that afternoon that tested Solara's certainty. There was a dispute in one of the settlements near the old conflict zone, tensions flaring over resource allocation, old wounds resurfacing, threats of violence that echoed the worst days of the crisis. The local mediators had requested assistance from anyone involved in the original peace talks. "You should go," Solara said immediately when Garrett told her. "It'll take at least a week, maybe two. And the situation could be dangerous." "Then you definitely should go. This is what you do. You fix broken systems." She paused, "And I'm coming with you." "Solara, I grew up in that region. I know the families involved, the history, the grudges that predate the crisis. You need someone who can navigate the cultural complexities, and I need to help my people heal. We go together or neither of us goes." He wanted to argue to protect her from potential danger, but he saw the determination in her eyes and the set of her ears and knew that arguing would be both futile and insulting. Together, he agreed. They traveled to the settlement, finding a community on the edge of fracturing. The dispute was ostensibly about water rights, but underneath were years of accumulated resentment, accusations of favoritism during Reconstruction, and fear that peace was fragile enough to shatter with the right pressure. Garrett did what he'd always done: listened carefully, documented concerns, searched for legal frameworks that might accommodate everyone's needs. But it wasn't enough. The history was too heavy, the emotions too raw. That's when Solara stepped in. She spoke to the elders in their own dialects, referencing family connections and shared histories that Garrett hadn't known existed. She brought the human settlers and Valith residents together for a meal using recipes that honored both cultures. She organized working groups to address the water distribution problem practically, while also acknowledging the emotional weight of feeling unheard and unvalued. Garrett watched her move through the community with grace and authority, realizing that she'd been doing invisible labor all along, not just in his home, but in the broader work of rebuilding trust between their peoples. "She's remarkable," one of the local leaders told Garrett on the fourth day. "You're lucky to have her." "I know," Garrett said, meaning it more deeply than the person could know. "We heard she was assigned to you through the gratitude program." "That must be an interesting dynamic." "She wasn't assigned. She volunteered. And there's nothing interesting about it. We're just two people who chose each other." The leader smiled. "That's clear to anyone who watches you together. The way you communicate without words, the way you work in tandem, that's not duty, that's devotion." The word stayed with Garrett. Devotion. Not obligation or gratitude or any of the things people tried to reduce their relationship to. Devotion, the choice to care, maintained through action and renewed through time. By the end of the second week, they'd brokered a solution that satisfied most parties and established a framework for ongoing communication. The settlement wasn't healed, but it was stabilized, which was often the best anyone could hope for. On their last evening, sitting on a hill overlooking both the human and Valith sections of the settlement, Garrett watched the sun set in colors that neither Earth nor Valith produced alone. Brilliant oranges and purples and blues that only existed here, in this in-between space where two worlds met. "I've been thinking," he said. "Dangerous habit," Solara teased. "About bonding, about what it means and whether I'm ready and how to know for certain." She turned to look at him, her ears rising with attention, her skin shifting through colors too quickly for him to track. "And," she prompted when he paused too long, "I realized I've been thinking about it wrong. I kept asking myself if I was ready for forever, as if ready was a state you achieved and then maintained. But watching you this week, watching us work together and help people and just exist in the same space, I realized ready isn't a destination. It's a direction. I'm not ready for forever in the sense of having it all figured out, but I'm ready to choose you every day and figure it out as we go." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside were two threads, one a deep blue that matched Solara's natural skin tone, one an earth-toned brown that matched his own hair. He'd spent the previous evening learning the traditional Valith weaving pattern from a local elder who'd been delighted to teach him. "I know this isn't the full ceremony," he continued, his hands only shaking a little. "And I know I probably messed up some of the cultural protocols, but I wanted to ask, in the way your people ask, if you would bond with me, if you would let me choose you every day for as long as we both live, if you would teach me how to make this work and be patient when I'm slow to learn and trust that, even when I don't understand everything, I understand that I love you." Solara's skin cycled through every color he'd learned, and several he hadn't, finally settling on a brilliant gold so bright it almost hurt to look at. Tears tracked down her face, catching the sunset light. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, you beautiful, ridiculous human who learned to weave bonding threads and thinks he needs to apologize for not following perfect protocol. Yes to all of it. She held out her hands, and he wove the threads around their joined fingers in the pattern he'd learned, each loop a promise, each knot a commitment. It wasn't the full ceremony, that would come later, with families and witnesses and formal vows. But it was real, a declaration made on a hill between two worlds by two people who'd chosen to build a third world together. Can we do this again tomorrow night? Solara asked softly, echoing the question that had started everything. Every night, Garrett promised, for as long as you'll have me. Forever then, she said, and kissed him while the sun finished setting on their old lives and rose somewhere else on their new one. They returned home a week later to find their house exactly as they'd left it, except Patricia had filled it with flowers and left a note. Congratulations, you crazy kids. Next time don't leave for 2 weeks without telling anyone. We were worried. Solara moved through the rooms, touching familiar objects, her ears tilted in that way that meant contentment. This feels different now. Different how? More permanent. More like it's actually ours instead of yours with me in it. It's been hours since you moved in, possibly since you arrived, definitely since that first dinner. She turned to face him, her skin settling into warm silver. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Always. When I first asked, can we do it again tonight, what did you think I was asking? He felt his face heat. Honestly, I had no idea. My brain was too tired to process anything. Why? Because I've wondered if part of you thought I was asking for something else, something more intimate, and if that's why you were so confused. Did you mean it that way? No, but I wouldn't have minded if you'd thought I did. She smiled, stepping closer. I was asking about dinner, about connection, about being seen. But if I asked now, it would mean all of those things and also the obvious thing that human minds probably jump to. And are you asking now? I'm saying that I've chosen you in every way I know how. And if there are more ways to choose you, I'd like to explore those too. When you're ready, if you're ready. Garrett pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her, flowers and something else that was uniquely Solara, uniquely home. I'm ready for everything with you. The dinner conversations and the lazy Sundays and the bonding ceremony and all the ways people choose each other. I'm ready to be terrible at Valeth cooking and to teach you about human movies and to build a life that belongs to both of us. Even though I'll probably keep reorganizing your workspace. Even though you have objectively wrong opinions about proper filing systems. She laughed against his chest, her ears doing that flutter that meant joy. We're going to be insufferable, aren't we? One of those couples everyone either wants to be or wants to avoid. Absolutely, and I can't wait. That night they had dinner together, same as every night.